Okay, guys, so today we're going to be talking about the causes of the Civil War, and there are several of them. We're going to kind of look over the highlights today. And what you see in front of you right now is not a brawl that you would see in a bar or outside in the street, but it actually took place in Congress. The person that is being beaten with a cane is Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, who 2 days prior to the beating had given a speech lamenting South Carolina and other southern states for their position on slavery. He was even quoted as saying, specifically targeting the senator from South Carolina, Senator Andrew Butler, by saying, "Senator Butler has chosen a mistress, I mean the harlot known as slavery." And it's actually during the speech that Stephen Douglas, who we're going to hear about here in a second, leaned over to a colleague and said, "That damn fool will get himself killed by some other damn fool." And the speech that he gave railing against the Southern institution of slavery lasted over 2 days. And we're looking at right around 1856 is when this happened. Now, a representative from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, really took exception to this, mainly because of the fact that Sumner was attacking a fellow South Carolinian. But the other reason why Preston Brooks was so incensed is that Andrew Butler was a relative of his. And so after the speech was done, Brooks walked up to Sumner, who was sitting at his desk working in Congress, and said that you have libeled my state and slandered my white-haired old relative, Senator Butler, and I have come to punish you for it. Brooks then proceeded to repeatedly strike Sumner over the head with a gold-tipped cane. In fact, he beat Sumner so savagely that it was years before Sumner was able to return to the Senate floor. Preston Brooks's cane snapped for the ferocity of the beating. And this event was vilified in the North. Yet another example of Southern aggression towards people or anyone that spoke out against slavery. Whereas in the South, Preston Brooks was given a hero's welcome. In fact, he was sent several brand new canes just in case he needed to go back to Congress and teach those Northerners a lesson. So while this event may seem somewhat comical or tragic, at least in the case of Sumner's case, we can see how the violence that is seen starting to erupt over the country over the issue of slavery is spilling over into the halls of government. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the picture you see here is actually of Harper's Ferry. And Harper's Ferry was an arsenal, a federal arsenal in Virginia, where arms and munitions were kept. And it's actually going to be the site of an event that is going to incite northern inspiration and southern condemnation. And the event I'm referring to is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Basically, he was a radical abolitionist, and John Brown and 18 of his followers seized the arsenal that's pictured here at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, on the evening of October 16th, 1859. Brown's goal was to incite, basically, or start a slave uprising. Unfortunately for him, it was an operation that was doomed to fail. Once he was captured and tried for treason, the response to his death and later hanging across the North was that of mourning a martyr, essentially for the cause of defeating slavery. Whereas in the South, he was seen essentially as a Northern terrorist. So what you're going to see is that the way these events progress upon one another is that this tension that is building between the North and the South is something that's going to be stretched until the point that it eventually breaks in 1860. So when you are done listening to this, you can go ahead and progress to the next slide. So on this slide, we're going to be talking about the man that's pictured here at the left. His name is David Wilmot. And the one way I like to remember him is that David Wilmot is the man that picked the scab of slavery. As we all know, it's kind of gross to pick scabs, and what happens when you pick a scab is usually it starts bleeding again. And really try and think of the issue of slavery as that scab. It's the one thing that was avoided in terms of conversation by people in government because they knew how divisive it was. And David Wilmot, through his action, is going to pick at that scab, reopening the issue of slavery for debate. This is as a result of the end of the Mexican-American War, and it actually is put forward during the Mexican-American War, where Wilmot suggests and puts forward legislation that says any territory that's gained from Mexico as a result of victory in the conflict, that territory should not be open to slavery. Now, this is very controversial because most of the territory that, at least at that point, was looked upon as being gained by the United States would have fallen under the Missouri Compromise line, which meant that it would have been, and it's already been earmarked, as future slave territories and states. And it was passed, his proviso was passed 4 times by the House of Representatives and rejected 4 times by the Senate. And what it really did is it reopened that issue of slavery. And what we also see during the late 1840s, early 1850s, is we start to see political parties change once again. You can see here, just by the 3 elections that are pictured, you have the addition of the Republican Party by 1856, the Know Nothing Party in 1852, which is a party that really is very anti-immigrant, but also just doesn't want to talk about the issue of slavery. So you have political parties yet again changing in American history. So really, when we talk about the causes of the Civil War, it really begins, or at least when things really start to get heated up, it begins with the Wilmot Proviso. So once you're done copying the slide, go ahead and progress to the next one. So the Compromise of 1850 is very much like the Missouri Compromise in that it prevented the Civil War from being fought earlier than it actually was. After the war with Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that was signed in 1848 gave basically what you see there is present-day Texas, the kind of purplish territory of Utah and New Mexico, and present-day California over to the United States. So it's a huge chunk of land. And if you look at where the Missouri Compromise line is located, most of that land would have been underneath the Missouri Compromise line, which would have made it a slave territory or slave states. And you can imagine how Northern abolitionists felt about this. Now, the problem with the Missouri Compromise line is that it cuts the state of California into 2. And that's kind of a prize that's both sought after by both the South and the North. For not only its farming capabilities, but also for its trading capabilities, specifically with markets in Asia. And so Henry Clay, yet again, steps on the stage, just like he did with the Missouri Compromise. And he is one of the primary authors of what is known as the Compromise of 1850. And the deal basically goes down like this. The northern states get the following. California becomes a free state. In addition to California becoming a free state, the territories that were then known as the Utah and New Mexico territory were going to be decided by something called popular sovereignty, which we're going to get into in a little bit. Essentially where the population of a territory would vote before the territory became a state, whether or not they would be slave or be free. So those 2 were considered as somewhat of a win for the North. In terms of the South, what they got in exchange for this is that the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. Now, this legislation was extremely important because it meant that slaves had to be returned to Southerners even if they escaped to the North. Originally, the Underground Railroad only went up into the northern states because the idea was, well, you get out of slave territory, you're in a free state, you're a free person. But this law gave Southerners the right to basically ride into the North and at gunpoint recapture their slaves. Any whites that were seen in the aiding of slaves could actually be thrown in prison or be given fines. So this is seen as a huge victory for the South. And it also meant that now the Underground Railroad has to go all the way to Canada in order to get slaves out. You also have the kind of symbolic banning of slaves being sold in Washington, D.C., and Texas is given $10 million for the territory that becomes New Mexico. But the significance behind this is that, the free states get the numbers advantage. Whereas in the Compromise of the Missouri Compromise, we have an even distribution of free and slave states. But at this point now, it starts to be, the balance starts to be swayed towards the free states. And really, both sides walked away from the table not very happy. So even though it did prevent civil war and was supported by people like Stephen Douglas, who really got it through, neither side really left satisfied. So once you're done, you can go ahead and progress to the next slide. So in the slide previous, we mentioned this idea of popular sovereignty, and it's essentially it gives the right of residents of a territory to vote for or against slavery. In other words, you put it to a vote of the people rather than letting the Missouri Compromise line or any type of legislation that passed through Congress decide that. And it was a very practical idea which appealed to many people. Now, the territories of Kansas and Nebraska were highly disputed over what should happen to them. Now, remember, the Missouri Compromise line is still intact despite the Compromise of 1850. And both Kansas and Nebraska fall above the line. So Northerners simply expect that, well, when these become states, they're going to be organized as free territories. However, Stephen Douglas, who's a representative from the state of Illinois, and we're going to hear about him in a second, he wants those states to organize as quickly as possible so that way they can begin building the railroad through the Kansas and Nebraska territory. But in order to get this through, many Southerners are pushing this idea of popular sovereignty to Douglas, which infuriates the Northerners. And what ends up happening is that the bill passes that says, okay, both Kansas and Nebraska's territory, when they become states, their popular sovereignty is going to decide really what the fate of slavery is in that state. And as soon as that passed, it essentially totally tore apart the Missouri Compromise line. That was no longer in effect. And so you have both Northerners and Southerners flocking to Kansas and Nebraska, trying to sway the vote one way or another. And the picture you see at the bottom left is not a picture from the Civil War, but is actually a picture from 1856, the period known as Bleeding Kansas. Essentially, you had pitched battles between towns, whether they were free-soiling towns, basically abolitionist towns, or many of the pro-slavery group from Missouri had moved into Kansas to try and sway the vote. So you actually have violence erupting between not necessarily Northerners and Southerners, but pro-slavers and anti-slavers. So you could argue that the Civil War actually began in 1856. It's not until 1861 where both Kansas and Nebraska come into the Union as free states, and that date is significant because it's after the Civil War has already started. So yet again, you can see how the tension between both North and South, abolitionist and pro-slave, is starting to erupt into more instances of violence now. So once you're done, you can go ahead and proceed to the next slide. So we've talked about many of the important court cases in early American history, Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch versus Maryland. But really, when we talk about the middle portion of the 1800s, the Dred Scott case really takes the cake. It's a very important court case that we need to understand. And essentially, Dred Scott, who you see pictured at the left, was a former slave that was taken from a slave state by his owner into free territory and then into a free state. And by doing so and choosing to live there, Dred Scott said, well, I'm going to sue for my freedom because my master willingly took me into both a free territory and then a free state, therefore I must be a free man. Now the court case is brought all the way before the Supreme Court, and many Americans are actually hoping that this court case will settle this kind of debate over slavery and hopefully ease the tension that's been created between North and South. However, the Supreme Court decision did not do that. In fact, it did the opposite. It only increased the tension between the North and the South. The decision basically was this, is that since Dred Scott was a slave and not a citizen of the United States, he had no right to bring this case to court. Slaves, remember, were considered property. And it also, the decision went also on to say that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because the Constitution protects the right to property, and Congress has no right to forbid property, or slavery in this case, to its citizens. So because slaves are private property, their owners in theory can take them wherever they want. Now, this infuriated the North because it essentially meant that the South didn't feel like it had to negotiate with the North anymore. This is my personal property, I can take it where I want. And it really, the Northerners were incensed by this, and they thought that the federal government was actually being taken over by slave interests. So rather than diffuse the situation, the Dred Scott case only made it worse. So when you're done, you can continue to the next slide. So here's where we're introduced to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln first ran for a senatorial seat. He was already a member of Congress, but ran for a senatorial seat from Illinois, his home state. And in 1858, he and Stephen Douglas had a series of debates. There were 7 in total that kind of happened all over the state of Illinois. And the debates were obviously done to try and help make voters decide on who they would want as their senator. But it centered around the topic of slavery. Now, Lincoln was a part of the new Republican Party that was formed after the controversy of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Republican Party was founded essentially on the idea that slavery was evil and should be abolished in the territories. Now, that's an important distinction to make. Lincoln at any time did he ever say that he wanted to get rid of slavery in the South. Instead, Lincoln said, okay, keep slavery where it is in the southern states, but any new territory that is brought into the United States needs to be admitted as free territory. Now, Stephen Douglas, who personally did not agree with slavery, felt that the best way of solving this, and the only fair way, is through popular sovereignty. Now, the significance of the Lincoln-Douglas debates is that it kind of was a microcosm of how this issue was now being discussed all over the country, whether it be in a free or a slave-holding state. And everyone always assumes that because it's Abraham Lincoln that he actually won the senatorial election. He did not. Stephen Douglas won the election and beat Abraham Lincoln, which is no small feat. But 1860 really is when the tie between the North and the South is finally broken. In the election of 1860, you have a grand total of 4 candidates. You have Abraham Lincoln representing the Republican Party, Stephen Douglas representing the Democratic Party, John C. Breckinridge representing the Southern Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party was split in 2. And then John Bell, who was representing the Constitutional Union Party, which is a political party essentially formed to make sure the country stays together. People kind of saw the writing on the walls, what was happening. And after the election, Lincoln was elected president. And Southerners felt that they had lost all voice in government, mainly because in most Southern states, Abraham Lincoln was not even put on the presidential ballot, which is illegal. You cannot not put someone who's running for president on a ballot. I mean, to do that today would be ludicrous. So they felt, well, our voice is not being heard, and on December 20th of 1860, just before Lincoln is sworn in as president, South Carolina secedes from the Union. So when we talk about the Civil War starting, it started with the election of arguably one of our country's greatest presidents, who's pictured here. And later on, after I get back from paternity leave, and you guys look at the lecture on the Civil War, we're actually going to look at how the war aged Lincoln very severely. But really, when it comes to what caused the Civil War to happen in the end, or what caused the South to eventually secede, well, it was the election of, someone who we consider now one of our greatest presidents. So I hope you guys enjoyed the online lecture. This is kind of a first for me. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them via email or when I come back from paternity leave. All right? So go ahead and follow along with the next activity for today's lesson on the webpage, and we'll talk to you guys soon. All right? Bye-bye.